Oh, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you all very much indeed for coming along here today. Now, before I begin my talk this morning, as always, let me remind you about the offer that I always make to cruise guests, because quite simply, if you have any questions at all that arise from this morning's talk or any of my previous talks, please feel free to ask those questions whenever you see me around the ship, morning, afternoon, or evening, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm always available to receive your questions if you wish. But for me, one of the great pleasures of having all these sea days on a beautiful ship like Noordam is the opportunity to gaze out over the ocean and to appreciate the extraordinary beauty that there is to see. And in my talk this morning, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take you inside that incredible oceanic world. And I'm going to show you amazing creatures under the microscope which look as though they've come from another planet, and yet they share the same planet as us. And I'll also show you other animals in the ocean that we might be seeing for ourselves on this leg of the cruise adventure. But you know, the great thing about the oceans, or one of the fascinating things that we need to know about the oceans, is that they are not just an endless expanse of water that seems to go on forever and ever. Far better if we appreciated the oceans as a vast natural system. Now, it's true, it is a complex system out there. The oceans are a complex system. But today, I want to try and convince you, ladies and gentlemen, that they are so completely fascinating that we need to know about the oceans. And of course, in many ways, the oceans always seem to me just to be showing us just enough in order to whet our appetite to learn more and more all the time. So, for example, when we think about that remote chain of islands in the Pacific Ocean, Hawaii, they're always showing us just enough of the mountains, but those mountains in Hawaii are more extraordinary than what we see at the ocean's surface. So before too long, we realized that Mauna Kea, for example, just happens to be the largest mountain on this planet if we measure it from its base on the ocean floor to its summit. In actual fact, it's well over 30,000 feet tall, and it's a good distance taller than Mount Everest measures from its base to its summit. But that's just one example of how the oceans blow our mind with mind-boggling facts and superlatives. So in order for us to understand how the oceans work, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin at the beginning. Always a good place to start. And when we look back shortly after planet Earth was formed, about 4,500 million years ago, it really wasn't too long before the oceans too began to form. But a lot of people ask me, where did that vast amount of water actually come from? Well, the water partly came from condensation on the Earth's surface as the planet cooled. But a lot more water actually came up to the surface from deep within planet Earth through volcanic vents. And of course, we always have to remember that back in those days, about 4,000 to 4,500 million years ago, there was an awful lot more volcanoes then than there are today. So while the volcanoes were erupting on that very unstable early form of planet Earth, masses of water and, of course, water vapor too were forming themselves first into lakes, then into seas, and finally into the world's oceans. But of course, we must never make the mistake, ladies and gentlemen, of thinking that that early oceanic water was pure, fresh, and delicious. In actual fact, quite the opposite. And we've done a lot of careful chemical analysis over recent years, and we found that that early oceanic water was full of high concentrations of chlorine, bromide, iodine, boron, and nitrogen, as well as a whole lot of traces of other chemicals as well. But since we're thinking today about how the oceans of the world work, we have to realize that the water chemistry of the world's oceans has been changing all the time since the early formation of planet Earth 4,500 million years ago. And one of the main reasons why its water chemistry has been changing is because the rocks on the continent, the land masses in other words, have always been eroding under the influence of high winds or rivers or glacier ice, volcanoes of course, or other erosive influences. And a lot of the salts from the erosion has ended up in the oceans. So over the millions of years of the oceanic development and formation, the oceans really have been getting saltier and saltier. But another surprise, ladies and gentlemen, about how the oceans of the world work is that it wasn't too long after the formation of planet Earth that life began in the oceans. So we think that life actually began in the oceans about 3,500 million years ago, give or take a day or two, of course. But we know that from a lot of microscopic fossils that we've been able to date from all sorts of locations right around the world, we're beginning to develop quite a clear picture of how life began in the oceans. And when we look very carefully at those microscopic fossils from practically every continent, we find that they're a lot like the bacteria and algae, which are still alive today. Isn't that incredible? But within the vastness of the world's oceans, some people might think that these tiny, tiny creatures that you can barely see, or you need a microscope to see them, a lot of people think that these tiny creatures couldn't possibly make any difference to the oceans or life in the ocean. But I have to say that if it wasn't for these creatures, if it wasn't for the bacteria and the algae, quite simply, there would be no other life of any kind on Earth. There'd be no other life of any kind in the oceans, no other life on land or in the air. So it's quite a sobering thought, really, isn't it, to realize that these tiny creatures, which have lived in the oceans for about 3,500 million years, are the basis of all life on Earth. So without them, planet Earth would be completely sterile. We wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't be able to go on cruises, and that would be a tragedy. So we owe these algae and bacteria quite a debt, don't we? But even the largest of these bacteria and algae are only the tiniest fraction of an inch across, and many of them, as I said, you need a microscope to see them. And what we're seeing actually on the slide in front of us here is some of the creatures encased in the most delicate and beautiful shells. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just in case you're wondering what those shells are made of, I can explain that they're actually made, or some of them are made from calcium carbonate, while others are made from a natural substance called silica, a glassy substance. And as you can see from this slide, these tiny creatures come in many more different shapes than many people give credit for. So the possibilities seem almost endless within the phytoplankton community. And when we think about how tiny the microscopic creatures are and how many there are of them, if we were to imagine that we could just take a bucket of 1 cubic yard of ocean water pretty much anywhere in the world, there'd be about 200,000 of these tiny creatures just in that 1 cubic yard of water. A lot of people ask me, how on earth do you count 200,000 different creatures? Well, we have computers to do that. There isn't a graduate student going 1, 2, 3, because that just wouldn't work, ladies. It wouldn't work at all. But while we're looking at these amazing tiny creatures, which are the basis for every food web in every ocean that you'll ever visit, there's something missing from them, isn't there? And I wonder, can any of you see from this slide what is missing from these creatures? None of them have any means of self-propulsion, do they? So they have no way of getting themselves through the water. There's no way of steering themselves either. They just simply drift with the ocean currents. And that's why scientists actually call these tiny creatures phytoplankton. It's a strange-sounding word, isn't it, phytoplankton? It actually comes from the ancient Greek, literally meaning wandering plants. But if these creatures aren't able to propel themselves through the water in any way, and they can't, they most definitely have a brilliant ability of being able to capture energy from sunlight and then to convert that energy into the simple chemical substances that they need to live. That's an amazing trick to have, isn't it? And when you think that even the most advanced scientists in the world, in their multi-million dollar laboratories, are still trying to replicate that same trick, you realize how clever these tiny and insignificant appearing creatures really are. It really is an extraordinary trick of being able to convert the mineral from the ocean waters into the vegetable of their bodies. That really is something that we need to remember. But whenever we look at these extraordinary and fascinating phytoplankton communities, we need to remember that there are other communities in the ocean, still at the microscopic level, which are called zooplankton. And again, look at my slide, ladies and gentlemen. You'll see immediately what unbelievable variety of shapes these guys come in. And of course, we're still talking about creatures among the zooplankton populations, which are sometimes only composed of one single cell. But at that one single cell level, the variety of shapes is mind-boggling and always fascinating. It draws us in to learn more, doesn't it? And the main difference between these guys, the zooplankton, and the phytoplankton, which I was talking about a moment ago, is that these guys, the zooplankton, their body chemistry lacks the chlorophyll, which we find within the phytoplankton. So, of course, the zooplankton, these guys on the slide, they've got no choice that they have to eat the phytoplankton. And in that way, the zooplankton get all the chemicals they need to stay alive and to multiply and prosper. And it's actually that relationship between the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, the one feeding off the other, which is the basis of every food web in every ocean of the world. So it's an important thing for us to learn about as we begin to think about how the oceans work for different creatures in different oceans around the planet. But some of these zooplankton creatures, they look otherworldly, don't they? They look as though they come from a science fiction movie. And when we examine them under the microscope, as we are here, we find that there are such a variety. There are tiny worms there, and yet many of those worms are actually so small they are actually transparent. Some other creatures have their bodies studded in phosphorescent lights, so it's as if that they carry their own disco system on their own backs. Incredible, but true. And when we have a look at the tiniest of jellyfish, sometimes they're joined together in colonies which look like tiny pieces of rope. And some of those colonies of rope, even though they're microscopic creatures, those colonies can grow up to 3 feet long. It's an awful lot of phytoplankton, but that's how they join themselves up into communities. It's a lot of tiny jellyfish, isn't it? But as we look at more and more samples of these tiny creatures, which, as I say, are the basis of all life in every ocean, we see all such a variety. We see flatworms, for example. There's swimming crabs in there, enormous numbers of shrimps, and all these members are part of the permanent members of the zooplankton community. But you know, alongside the permanent members within these zooplankton communities, there are also temporary members as well, which appear within zooplankton communities for only part of their lives. So here I'm thinking about young starfish and crabs, which are only in their infancy, because I know what you're thinking. These don't look anything like starfish or crabs, but this is what starfish and crabs look like in their absolute infancy. And it's in that infancy when they take part, or they are a part of the zooplankton community. We also find worms and mollusks there as well, also as temporary members within their excuse me, sorry, temporary members within their infancy within the zooplankton community. And we have to remember that those larvae, as I say, they bear no relationship to how they are in their adult form, but all the time they're basically look like transparent globes, don't they? And as we can see here, other creatures with extraordinary shapes. Many of them, if we have a close look at their bodies, they are surrounded with hairs called cilia, and that is how the zooplankton are able to steer themselves a little bit through the water. Not the phytoplankton, but the zooplankton. And what do these guys do all day within their infancy? They feed, and feed. They really get building themselves up to move on to their other communities. But if you take all these vast communities of phytoplankton and zooplankton, they are the basis of every life of so many creatures, from the anchovy, the sardines, the herrings, right around the world. So it's these tiny fish that form like a thick soup, really, that feeds some of the most beautiful creatures in the world. Let's have a look at them, shall we? If we confine ourselves to the shallow waters, you find sea anemones that feed on nothing else but plankton, that thick soup of zooplankton and phytoplankton. And there are so many other creatures as well, coral polyps. They also confine themselves just to that thick soup of zooplankton and phytoplankton. But all those creatures are only able to stay in one place, and they confine themselves to comparatively shallow waters. But of course, now we need to think about where we are in the ocean, right in the middle of the ocean, right in the depths. So we need to think about how larger fish just only survive on this diet of thick soup. Nothing else. They only feed on phytoplankton and zooplankton. And as we get towards tropical waters, ladies and gentlemen, look out for manta rays, because for me they are among the most beautiful creatures in the world. But for all their beauty and all their size, their diet is confined to just the thick soup of the zooplankton and phytoplankton that I've been explaining about. But these guys, they are extraordinary, aren't they? From fin tip to fin tip, a fully grown adult male manta ray can measure 18 feet. It really is extraordinary. They are totally magnificent. And if we have a look at their head, can you see these flipper-like palps around their rectangular mouth? It's actually, they use those flipper-like palps to guide the plankton into their mouths. And as the water goes through their mouths and leaves the manta ray through slits in the side of its head, which we can see right there. Can you see where the laser beam is just behind its eye? The phytoplankton and zooplankton are trapped within fine combs, and it's within those fine combs that the manta ray actually catches and collects its plankton. But the same sort of apparatus which is used also by a distant cousin of the manta ray, and they are the basking sharks. And the basking sharks are even larger than the largest of manta rays. In actual fact, perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, you can guess just how large this fully grown adult male is by having a look at the size of those divers. Can you see the divers in the top left there? For a couple of friends of mine, just shows the scale of this guy. But all that this basking shark has fed on is nothing else but phytoplankton and zooplankton throughout its life. How heavy do you think a fully grown adult male basking shark can get just on this diet of thick soup? 4 tons. It's incredible, isn't it? How much water do you think that they can process in an hour? It's incredible. 1,000 tons of water in an hour. Now, that is a lot of phytoplankton and zooplankton that they get to feed on, isn't it? But they swim at only about 3 miles an hour. And that's really actually how they got their name, because for many years it was thought that they weren't feeding at all. It was assumed that they were simply basking in the sunlight that they find. But it's only in more recent years that actually we've realized that these guys will only ever swim at about 3 miles an hour. That's about the same pace that most of us walk, isn't it, on a good day? But just keeping themselves alive. But if you want to find basking sharks, you tend to have to look for them in the colder waters of the earth. But if you want to look in the warmer waters where we're heading, you can find an even larger shark which, again, only feeds on nothing more than a diet of thick soup, thick plankton soup, nothing more. Don't be deceived by the word shark. Many people think that all sharks are ravenous meat eaters. Not so. The whale, the basking shark, and these guys only eat the plankton soup of zooplankton and phytoplankton that I've been telling you about. But again, how large do you think that these guys could actually get? A fully grown adult male, 54 feet long. How heavy do you think that they could get? Again, on only a diet of thick phytoplankton and zooplankton soup, nothing else. 40 tons. It's incredible, isn't it? But if you see one, you should you consider yourself very lucky indeed. It's the old principle that whenever you are on the upper decks of Nordam, always have your cameras ready, because they're quite unforgiving. They won't wait for you to go back to your stateroom and get your camera. So you always have to be ready to see what you can see. But if you even got the fin tip or the tail of a whale shark, what a great vacation picture that would be. But I think when you see these guys, and particularly if you're fortunate enough to be in the water with them, they have a slow, majestic speed. They have a grace and an awesome power. It's one of those moments when you think you don't need to know any science at all to really appreciate how incredible these beautiful creatures really are. So that's another reason why you should always keep your eyes open when you're on the upper decks of Nordam, because you never know what you're going to see. But there's something else that really does contribute to the experience of being in the water with a whale shark, because they take very little notice of us if we maintain a respectable distance from them. And you notice around their mouths, actually, that there are always a surprising number of tiny fish, all of them picking off small scraps of food around the whale shark's lips. And so the tiny fish get a great deal out of it, because they have easy pickings from the lips of the whale shark. And of course the whale shark gets a free grooming service, so both sides of the equation are happy. I also really need to briefly mention that there are other tiny fish that actually, believe it or not, swim around the backside of the whale shark, and they pick off bits and pieces of excrement from the whale shark. So one way or another, the whale shark really does its bit for recycling in the oceans. But it's always interesting to remember that the manta rays, the basking sharks, and the whale sharks all belong to a very ancient group of fish called the elasmobranchs. And the main thing that we need to remember about the elasmobranchs, what they have in common, concerns their skeletons. Their skeletons aren't like ours. Our skeletons are made of bone. Their skeletons are actually made of cartilage. So that's a lot softer than bone, isn't it? But it's also far more resilient than bone when it's buffeted by all the ocean currents all the time. So that's the main advantage that they have over a bony skeleton fish. But across the millions of years, these early whale sharks formed different communities as they interbred. And one of the great whale shark subgroups formed these guys, the great white sharks, which of course we know, we fear rightly to do so. If ever you saw a great white shark in the wild, it could be a fully grown adult male, could be at least 18 feet. But we should never be surprised, ladies and gentlemen, to see a great white twice that size. They, of course, do not just feed on plankton soup. We know what their diet is all about. But, you know, there are many species of shark that we need have no fear of whatsoever, and we can comfortably swim with them. It's an amazing experience to swim with some of these guys. Let me tell you about some of them. And the great white-tipped reef shark is a shark that often swims around coral areas where there are tour excursions, and you can easily, comfortably, and safely swim with these guys. I've done it many times, and it's a fascinating and extraordinary experience to actually swim with these sharks. They are probably more afraid of us than we are of them, so it's a safe thing to do. But it's still a magical and amazing experience if you're able to snorkel with them. It really is something I recommend to you all. I actually took this picture last year in the Maldives Islands. And it always seems best that if you're able to sit on the sea floor, about 45 feet below the surface, and you just wait for these guys to form out of the blue surrounding you, and you can really see how hydrodynamically evolved they are. But the more we actually have a look at these guys, the more we can get rid of that old idea, and an idea that TV documentary makers still make in error. They all often describe sharks as being hydrodynamically perfect, don't they? Well, that's an old-fashioned idea that we can now dispel. Actually, we can see how they're not hydrodynamically perfect. Have a look at the fins either side of this shark's head. And we realize that those fins are fixed. So in practical ways, the shark never has any brakes at all. And since they're heavier than water, they're unable to hover in any way. So they can't hang in the water. So they always have to keep swimming. In actual fact, they have to keep swimming in order to stay alive. So when they come across anything that's a bit of a mystery to it, they would either just swim on by or take a trial bite out of it if it seems small enough and appetizing enough. So if that's a little bit about the background to how the oceans work for the manta rays, the basking sharks, the whale sharks, and all their elasmobranch ancestors and cousins, we now need to move on to see how different creatures work, how the oceans work for different creatures, and these are quite different, as we can see. And the first thing that these small bony skeleton fish have, which is different to the elasmobranchs, is that they have an air sac within their body to give themselves greater buoyancy. So they can swim to almost any depth that they can manage. And they also have a pair of fins, not only at the front, but at the back of their bodies as well, which can be swiveled in any direction. With the sharks, their front fins are fixed, but these guys are amazingly maneuverable. Now, some descendants of these early bony fish have also become plankton feeders, just like the manta rays, the basking sharks, and the whale sharks. But of course, none of these bony fish ever grew to the size of those whale sharks and manta rays. And that's because these guys feed on plankton in a totally different way to the big guys. So instead of being solitary plankton feeders like the manta rays, the basking sharks, and the whale sharks, the bony fish actually always swim in vast shoals that feed, move, and coordinate really like one giant entity. And if you want to think about these shoals as being a single moving, feeding life form, they are undeniably larger than any whale shark, because some of these shoals of anchovy, which we might see from the upper decks of Nordam, for example, that some shoals can literally measure several miles across. No exaggeration. That's just one single shoal of fish. Look out for them when you're on the upper decks of Nordam. And sometimes the members of those larger shoals, very tightly packed shoals indeed, actually break the surface of the ocean, so that we can actually see some of those shoals sometimes on sea days. So do look out for them when you're on the upper decks of Nordam. And of course, if you're able to zoom in on your camera to those upper fish, they're often gasping in the air, waiting for their colleagues lower down to make space for them so that they can go down. But what we find, actually, that there's a difference in behavior. So the anchovy will only ever feed on phytoplankton. They won't touch the zooplankton, whereas the herring will feed on phytoplankton and zooplankton. So different fish make the oceans work for themselves in different ways. But in addition to the anchovy and herring, did you realize there are 20,000 other species of fish that have bony skeletons and which shoal together and feed in the way that these guys do? 20,000 species. That is how the oceans work for them. But if that's how things are with the larger plankton feeders, such as the elasmobranchs, those manta rays, basking sharks, and whale sharks, and how the oceans work also for the smaller fish, now I need to move the story on to how the oceans work for their competition, because there's always competition throughout the oceans. But in order for me to explain how the competition works, I need to take us all back in time, 200 million years years. But although 200 million years in time sounds an awful lot of time for us, actually in comparison to the total age of planet Earth, 200 million years is only 4% of the total age of planet Earth. So really, 200 million years, that takes us back to the Triassic times, doesn't it? It's really only a drop in the ocean. But imagine ourselves back 200 million years ago, something incredibly interesting was happening. And we know from all sorts of fossils that we've found all around the world that many kinds of cold-blooded creatures had actually evolved from the fish. And those cold-blooded creatures had already begun to make a life for themselves, not in the oceans, but they had evolved on land. But by about 200 million years ago, many of those land-based reptiles had begun to spend more and more time back in the ocean again. So it's from those reptiles returning to the sea, and of course from the fossil record as well, that we find creatures like the turtle evolve. And again, when we get into tropical waters, look out for these beautiful creatures as well. And I know on some tour excursions, sometimes you're able to swim with them as well, which again is a magical experience. It's a great way of getting up close and personal with how the oceans work for these fascinating guys. And of course, more recently, again, some of the birds, seagoing birds, they abandoned flying and they settled on the water. And so they have evolved eventually into penguins. And of course, for us to understand this extraordinary evolutionary story of how the oceans have worked for these creatures throughout their evolution, the fossil record from around the world is absolutely essential. So, for example, if we were to have a look at this fossil from a penguin of about 36 million years ago, we can use this as perhaps one piece in a puzzle to see how penguins have evolved from the seabirds into penguins as they are today, and how the oceans have worked for penguins from those times, and how things work in more recent times. But if we press the fast forward button on history and take ourselves to 150 million years ago, and of course we all know about 150 million years ago because that was Jurassic. You remember the movie Jurassic Park? Well, 150 million years ago was around that time. And of course the mammals started to appear on the land, and they were warm-blooded and of course, being mammals, covered in hair. And people often ask, why were mammals covered in hair? Because the earliest mammals were actually nocturnal. They needed the hair to keep them warm. So that's part of their story, but I'm sticking to the oceans mainly today. And we've actually learned that some species of the mammals were tempted to return to the oceans because there were so many more feeding opportunities within the oceans than there were compared to the land. And it seems that the first mammals actually returned to the seas about 50 million years ago. And that's during the Eocene times, isn't it? So 50 million years, it sounds an extraordinary amount of time, but compared to the whole of the Earth, it's only 1% of the total span of Earth. And of course, eventually, these guys, incredibly but true, evolved into these guys, the whales. But that's only part of the extraordinary evolutionary story that we find with whales, because, of course, the fossil record, we need it at every stage, because to go from here to here is quite a story, and that is amazing, but true. But within the whale community, and I hope you get to see some whales actually on this leg of the cruise, because to see a whale, even from some distance, is always a thrill, isn't it? There are two main types of whale, so the oceans work in quite different ways for different whale communities. And one of the forms of whales have a baleen. They don't have teeth at all, and it's through these baleen, rows of baleen, which hang down from their upper jaw. They sift through just a diet of phytoplankton and zooplankton. But there are other creatures as well which are able to just grow to extraordinary proportions. This humpback whale, for example, they can grow to 190 tons simply on a diet of phytoplankton and zooplankton. And yet on that apparently meager diet that we might think it's just a meager diet, these guys are strong enough to throw themselves out of the water. And an ability to throw 190 tons of yourself out of the water is incredible. So if we're able to see anything like this on our journey, it's going to be amazing. But always for be ready to see sperm whales, because practically on every route of every cruise that you'll ever make, sperm whales are out there. I'll be talking about more about sperm whales, I think it's the day after tomorrow, but more of that to come. But the extraordinary story of how the oceans work for different creatures at different times in different places around the world, it never stops still. The evolutionary story is always unfolding. And so several million years after the whales began to evolve as mammals returning to the sea, we find that other mammals, which were related to the early bears and the early otters, they too began to return to the sea. Let's have a look at some of them, shall we? Well, we know them today as the walruses, the seals, and the sea lions. But I'm going to stay with these guys, ladies and gentlemen, just for a moment, because their evolutionary story isn't yet complete. In other words, they can't completely live in the oceans all the time. So their evolutionary development within the oceans is still unfolding. For example, although the whales have lost their back legs, these guys, as we can say, well, just about, have retained their back legs. So that's one feature that shows how they haven't completely adapted to life in the ocean. Also, look at this guy's face. He looks like a land-living carnivore, doesn't he? He kind of looks like an otter. Also, we find that walruses, seals, and sea lions aren't able to mate in ocean waters, and also they're not able to give birth in the ocean waters, so they always need to come onto the land for that. So these guys' evolutionary story isn't yet complete. But you know, sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, cruise guests often ask me if this amazing procession of evolution is still going on today. And incredibly, it is. Let's have a look at a good example, shall we? A polar bear. Now, the polar bears of the North Atlantic or the Arctic region spend most of their time actually in the water, in the form of either ice floes or actually swimming in the water itself. And we would be right to say, of course, they do still look like a land-based mammal. In actual fact, in size and shape, they look most like a grizzly bear, don't they? But the thing we need to remember about the polar bear, ladies and gentlemen, that they have already started to make the ocean work for them in a fascinating way. For example, a polar bear is able to keep its eyes open underwater. No grizzly bear can do that. Also, these guys, the polar bears, are able to keep their nostrils closed underwater. Grizzly bears can't do that. And also, polar bears are able to stay submerged, in other words, underwater, for up to 2 minutes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you tried to make a grizzly bear stay submerged under the water, that grizzly bear would have something to say on the subject. So what a lot of scientists are beginning to think is that polar bears have begun to move down an extraordinary evolutionary development. And, of course, it's a big if. If that path is uninterrupted, they could evolve into something truly extraordinary. So come back in a few million years and we'll see what's happening. But isn't it fascinating to see how evolution is just starting? We can see the early signs of fresh evolution. It's amazing what you can see actually in the oceans. But so far, what have we been looking at? We've been seeing how the oceans work for different creatures in all sorts of astonishing, but always interrelated stories, isn't it? All these creatures' stories have been interrelated. So let's go back into the ocean where we are now, in the middle of the ocean, to see how all these extraordinary shoals of anchovy and, of course, shoals of herring affect how the oceans work for other creatures as well. And of course, the question is of enormous interest, not only to scientists, but also to the meat-eating fish, which feed on anchovy, herring, and sardine. So first of all, we need to think about the mackerel, for example, which feed on the anchovy, sardine, and herring. And then we go one stage further up the food web to have a look at these fascinating guys, the barracuda, 6 feet long of a hunting machine. And if we go up further, we reach the sharks and the tuna. So again, always at every level, in every ocean, we see that everyone's life and how they make the oceans work for themselves is always interrelated on other creatures within the food web, within the ocean. And I have to say that's part of the reason why the oceans are just so fascinating. But when we think about the tuna compared to the sharks, surprisingly, it is the tuna which are far more hydrodynamically perfect than the sharks. I was telling you about that the sharks don't have breaks, but the variety of tuna that we find around the world is nothing short of a miracle, really. And so many different fishermen around the world have different names for a tuna. So if you come across names like tunny or albacore or king mackerel, skipjack, marlin, sailfish, bonito, or the wonderfully named wahoo from Hawaii, they're all members of the tuna family. And it's really no wonder that some of the tuna are of great interest to fishermen, because some of the larger tuna species can weigh up to 1,400 pounds, and that's about half a metric ton, isn't it? But while I'm thinking about the fascinating story of different fish in different parts of the ocean, I really want to tell you about the swordfish, because, as I was saying the other day, often these guys appear on our evening dinner menu, don't they? So we need to know what we're eating. But these guys are actually the largest bony skeletoned fish in the world. So we need to know about how the oceans work for them. In actual fact, from the front tip to the tail, they can actually measure up to 18 feet. So they really are incredible. But the hydrodynamic evolution of these guys is fascinating. The crescent-shaped tail really helps with their flow through the water. But do you realize that even their eyes are hydrodynamically evolved so that they don't actually impede the flow of water across their bodies? But it's, the amazement of these guys, it goes even further than that. Right across their body, ladies and gentlemen, they have different textures of scales which break up the flow of water across their body. So it's as if they have like a spoiler. You know, on an Indy car or a Formula One racing car, they have spoilers. These guys found the idea of having a spoiler within their body to make them go fast millions of years before Formula One or Indy cars ever got the idea. So the more we have a look at these guys, the more extraordinary they go. But how fast do you think the fastest swordfish can travel? 60 miles an hour. No one's given them a ticket yet, according to my research. But it really is extraordinary how we find mind-boggling facts about these guys. But I have to say, if you find 60 miles an hour fascinating, what about the sailfish? And they can swim as fast as a cheetah can run. That is an amazing fact, isn't it? These guys are the fastest marine creatures in the world, 68 miles an hour. And people often ask me, how on earth can these creatures actually swim at 68 miles an hour? Not all the time, of course, but when they want to, for short speeds. Well, there's two real reasons. First of all, you notice this guy, he's swimming with his mouth open, so he gets a whole load of oxygen into his body, so it makes him far more supercharged. But also, they have a real secret. They are able to keep their muscles about 12 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding water. So just like any other athlete who always wants to keep their muscles warm, these guys also keep their muscles warm, and that is a part of the reason why they can swim just so fast. They are truly extraordinary. So when you're seeing a tuna perhaps on a fish market, stop and marvel at what you're seeing. Now, I know, as always, time is always against me, isn't it? I'm going to finish with one surprise. Did you know, ladies and gentlemen, that there are actual deserts in the ocean? It just sounds a silly thing to say. Right around pretty much every continental shelf, there are areas of sand where pretty much there's no life at all. And yet, life always finds a way. And there are garden eels that are able to feed. Well, you'll guess the answer already. They only feed on the phytoplankton diet and the zooplankton diet that I've been telling you about throughout this talk. It just shows how amazing variety of life can find a way just on zooplankton and phytoplankton. It emphasizes how important the zooplankton and phytoplankton is. But look at these guys. They're all standing up in the sand, in the shallow parts of the continents. I've got another question for you. How can they fix themselves? Can you see that they're all fixed? They're not going to move around. How can they fix themselves to that sand? Well, they have very few resources to hand. What they do is to use some of their mucus, would you believe? And they use their mucus to actually anchor themselves to the sand. And while they're firmly anchored using their mucus, they can actually sway around and take in as much phytoplankton and zooplankton as possible. Now, I know we've only had 45 minutes together, but I hope I've shown you, or at least whetted your appetite to learn more about how the oceans work for so many different creatures throughout the route of our cruise adventure, but also on the routes of all your future cruise adventures. For me, though, it's just a great pleasure to share all these natural wonders with you. And as always, I'm really grateful for your time and for listening to my talk this morning. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much.